start with pointing out that women have made enormous gains in just a few generations. My grandmother, who was born at the end of the 19th century, spent her life as domestic, in the home, never worked, did not have the right to vote, did not have the right to sit on a jury, a host of other rights. In one, just my grandmother, utterly changed to what my life is and my aspirations. But despite all the gains that women have made through the 20th century and today, we are still a very long way from equality, let alone liberation. For instance, the higher you look up in society, the less women you see. It's the same for the less black people you see, the less Asian people you see, but the less women you see. And an example of this is in Britain, where there are more people called John, a male name, than there are women running any of the top 100 companies in Britain. So not only are women the minority, there are more men with one single name than women who run these companies. That's an example of how narrow it is. And Marx favourably quoted this. He said, Karl Marx, he said, "The degree of emancipation of women is the natural measure of general emancipation in any society." So by any measure, it's clear how far we are from general emancipation, simply because the situation for women is still so bad. And if you look across the globe, outside of Western Europe, if you look across the globe, the experience of oppression of millions of women who are more likely to be living in poverty, more likely to be illiterate, more likely to die of not having access to clean water than men. You see a situation that women's oppression can mean the difference of life and death, and the economic crisis has only made this situation worse across the system. So today we're going to talk about Marxism and feminism, and there have been well over a century of debates between feminists and Marxists and socialists about women's oppression. And many of these, if you look at some of the leading revolutionary socialists at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was mass struggles for women to get the vote, even at a time actually when many men did not also have the vote. Rich men had the vote in Britain and in other countries. And you saw people voting, fighting for equality for the vote. But many revolutionary socialist women were very wary of what some of the richer women were fighting for. They too did not have the vote, they wanted the vote, but there was not a unity of interest between them. And Alexandra Kollontai, Russian revolutionary socialist and Bolshevik, she wrote in 1913 about what she referred to as the bourgeois feminists of the period, who appeared just to be striving for equality, but for them equality meant equality with the men of their class. And that would leave the working class and poor women getting equality, but with the men of their class. Now, I want equality, but I also want more, and that's how the Kollontai expressed it. And she said of the ruling class women who were fighting for the vote, they said their aim is to achieve the same advantages, the same power, the same rights within capitalist society as those possessed now by their husbands, fathers and brothers. What is the aim of the women workers? In contrast, their aim is to abolish all privileges deriving from birth or wealth. So she was saying we're all fighting for the vote because women were denied the vote entirely, but when it came to it, the working class women were fighting for more than just equality within capitalism. They were fighting to get rid of the system as a whole. And so she was pointing to a situation we still see here today, and in fact because some women have reached the top, you can see how some of those women are happy to continue to exploit and oppress others, poor working class women and men, because it upholds their wealth. You can see that, for instance, in Britain, where rich ruling class women have 24-hour nannies, and people who look after their children, and people who cook. Working class women, some of them have travelled the globe to serve their lives, to make it possible for them to have careers and have a family. Recent years have seen, I think, a renewed interest in the ideas of feminism, women's liberation, and fighting for women's rights. theoretical ideas that came from the 1970s and 1980s, intersectionality, privilege theory. These things are reappearing, and people are looking to try to understand women's oppression and looking back to some of the feminist points in history of the past. And I think for many young activists, this comes from a frustration that women are still not treated equally, and actually, and certainly in Britain and in America, in the United States, a situation where there is new sexism, new crude expressions of women's oppression, that actually, new manifestations of oppression, that they are frustrated and angry about. And I think we have to start by saying those activists, many of whom identify as feminists, socialist feminists or whatever, we're together in the fight against sexism, together in the fight against oppression, that we share that anger and distaste and bitterness about women's situation. But I think we also have to say, often we have different explanations and analysis of where women's oppression comes from, and that can lead to different strategies to how to fight it. And feminism, to be honest, is not one single school of thought. It can be many different things. Feminism is not, even at the height of the women's movements of the 1960s and 70s, feminism did not mean one thing. It was a multitude of different ideas. But to make it simple today, let's say one of the dominant ideas of many people who argue a feminist theory and socialist feminist is an argument that says Marxism, that is, my tradition, the tradition of the organisation here, that perhaps it's not sufficient to explain women's oppression. It perhaps needs something else. And how many socialist feminists would argue it? They would say that there is exploitation of workers, class, on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have oppression of women and other oppressions. And the idea is that actually the thing that causes oppression is patriarchy. Patriarchy is a thing, again, that can mean many things, but simply said, patriarchy is the rule of men, male power, that in some sense all men have got a collective, joined interest in oppressing all women, that there is something called patriarchy that exists here to oppress women, and something called exploitation here, which is to exploit workers. And the argument that they put is that these run in parallel, that they are distinct from each other. Now, the consequences of that analysis means that perhaps there are two struggles. That on the one hand you struggle against exploitation, and on the other hand you have a separate struggle against women's oppression. And I think that when you look at this, you can see this idea that there is sort of parallel railway tracks of oppression and exploitation I want to reject. But it has a powerful pull, often referred to as the dual systems approach when you read the theory books. It has a powerful pull because it appears to reflect what society looks like. It appears that oppression touches all women. I think it does. Oppression does not just affect working class and poor women. But we are told Marxists, or the critique of Marxists that comes from many feminists, is that we concentrate on class, and therefore we haven't got an explanation of oppression, because oppression cuts across class, it affects other women. And of course the outward appearance is that. I mean, in Britain, for example, Kate Middleton is our future queen. You may have seen her in the newspapers. She's just had a baby. Like, that's a revolutionary thing. But the obsession that the media has with her as a future queen, she's a member of the ruling class, or Theresa May, we have a Home Secretary who is a Tory, a right-wing, horrible Tory. The obsession the media have is with her shoes, with her hair, with her body. Now, this is clearly sexist. They are members of the ruling class, women who are very powerful in many ways, but they are treated they are trivialized as women. In the City of London, where all the wealthy bankers work, there are female bankers, but they earn less than the men. They earn much more than most women, but they earn less than the same men. They suffer sexual harassment. So, absolutely, oppression affects women across society. But it's not as simple as that. And as Karl Marx said, all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. So what he meant was, if everything was just as it seemed, there would be no need for theory or for trying to understand things, because it would be so. But for us, I think we need to dig below outward appearance to try to understand what is going on. And therefore I would say to a rich female banker, or to the future queen, or to the Home Secretary, is your situation, the sexism you suffer, is it the same as a working class woman on the minimum wage, working shifts, trying to sort out childcare, which is very expensive, trying to pay the rent, trying to pay the bills, and suffering harassment? Is her situation the same as that working class woman? I don't believe they are equivalent. I don't believe they are the same experience of oppression. So it's absolutely right that oppression does cut across class, and I am against the sexist way rich women are treated. Any woman who is treated and trivialised in a sexist way is wrong, and we should oppose it, whoever is the object of that. But we have to say, do those women at the top of society have the same interests as we do in this room? Do they want to turn society upside down to create an equal social society? No. They benefit from the way that society is divided. They benefit from the fact that many working class women facilitate their life, if you like. So they have different interests, even though oppression affects them. And I think, therefore, Marx's argument says oppression is not parallel and separate to class. It is rooted in class society, it grew out of class society, and it's still absolutely shaped by class society. And one final point on this section, you only have to look at the ruling class to understand that class and oppression are knitted together. Because the ruling class does not look like the working class. The ruling class is more white, more male. Therefore, the things are connected. There is a situation, these things are not running in parallel. They are connected. So when we come to today's debates about Marxism and feminism and how do we explain women's oppression, I think we have to start by saying they take place against a different background to 20, 30, 40 years ago. Because today, women growing up, a new generation of women growing up, expect to be financially independent, expect to work after having children, expect not to face blatant discrimination, and expect to be able to have children whether they're married or not married, or can decide never to have children at all and not to be judged, and expect to have access to a legal and safe abortion if they want one. Expect to control their fertility in a way my grandmother was unable to. These are new expectations and new life of women today against which debates about women's oppression take place. And none of these changes came without a fight. The ruling class did not want to give us free and legal abortion, did not want our personal lives. They wanted to impose a morality. They wanted to tell us to live in a certain way. Every single one of those games came with a fight, did not come out of the largesse of the ruling class or them being feeling kind towards us. And so when we look today, I think some of the situation for women is because we had big struggles in the 60s and 70s and a women's liberation movement in America that sprouted other ones across Europe, but we didn't get rid of capitalism. Capitalism survived those turmoil of the 60s, and so it has co-opted and absorbed some of the things we fought to win. And one of the most raw expressions of sexism today, certainly in Britain and America, is what's being called the new sexism. And it's called new because it is sexism with a twist. It's ironic. Because women are supposedly equal now, then when you treat a woman as a sex object, it's a joke. It's ironic, it's a bit fun. Why are you getting funny about this? We're all free now. And therefore the sexual liberation that we won, the idea that we were autonomous beings with our own desires, has been twisted in a society that is driven by profit into a new commodity. In Britain we have lap dancing clubs, pole dancing clubs, which are big business. People take their clients there to entertain them after work. These are seen as like normal part of life. Whereas 20 years ago, a strip club was seedy and in the back streets and something that was a bit shameful to go to. Now it's mainstream. And this sort of thing affects how women see themselves and how society sees them. And so I think this is part of the reason why in Britain we have a new generation of women saying we don't want to be treated as sex objects. We do not want to be commodities. We are not for sale. And this is something that I think you see in a rejection of both advertising and popular culture images of women, but also the rise of even cosmetic surgery, which is in Britain, 90% of cosmetic surgery is by women, and most of it is to get their breasts enlarged. These are sometimes teenagers, teenage young women whose bodies haven't even finished developing necessarily, but they feel they have got to look a certain way. And they pay £4,000, that's what, about €4,500 for breast enhancement. You know, what sort of society is it that does this to young women, that makes them feel they are not a real woman unless they are a certain shape? A shape, to be honest, which does not come naturally, to be skinny thin and to have very big breasts. So therefore you have to go and have surgery to fit the mould. And so the liberation we fought for is being sold back in this distorted way through the prism of a profit-driven society to give us new things that we have to buy, new things that we have to be in order to be women. And this is not about liberation or choice. This is not about empowerment, though the cosmetic surgery companies say, if you don't feel confident, come and have surgery. You will be empowered. You will be free. You will be confident about your body. You know, it's really disgusting. It is galling. So when we look at this situation in the 21st century for women, what does Marxism have to offer? What can Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, you know, men of the Victorian age, how can they relate? How can they help us understand this and help us challenge it? Well, Leon Trotsky, who we heard some of you in a meeting a little while ago, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, he said that for revolutionaries to change the conditions of life, you have to see them through the eyes of a woman. And what he meant was, any revolutionary who wants to fight for a better society has to understand the nature of oppression, has to understand that in order to fight for a better society. Because for any vision of socialism has to have women's liberation at its core. Otherwise it's not socialism. And so therefore the understanding of women's oppression for Marxists is utterly central to our politics. We are materialists as Marxists. What does that mean? It means that we do not believe that women's oppression is caused by sexist ideas in people's heads. The ideas in people's heads come from a society that is structured to oppress women. And if we can challenge that society, we can therefore also challenge the ideas which flow from that society. That is not an argument for ignoring sexist ideas. Every day we should do that. But we want more, don't we? We want to permanently get rid of sexism and women's oppression. And to do that, I believe we have to turn society upside down. We have to have a revolutionary change to society. And when we look at how women's oppression is rooted, where did it come from? We have to say, actually, women's oppression has not always existed. It is the oldest oppression. It will be the hardest to get rid of. It is so deeply entrenched. But the vast majority of human history, there was no women's oppression. There was no inequality. There was no hierarchies. There was no class. If you look at human history this long, class society is only this. Capitalism is only this. So we have lived in different ways for most of the time humans have lived. So the possibility, I don't want to go back to those days, the possibility of us having a socialist society in the future that doesn't have women's oppression and divisions and hierarchy is possible. We know it's possible. Marx and Engels said that women's oppression was rooted and shaped by her role in the family. And we have to understand the role in the family in order to understand women's oppression. That's the Marxist view. And I think to do this, you have to understand the family is a contradictory thing. It plays two roles. Well, it plays multiple roles, but two main roles in society: economic and ideological. Economic, because actually, families bringing up the next generation of workers and looking after the elderly and the sick and people who can't go out to work at any one time. This provides for what society, the ruling class, does not have to provide, because families are doing it. They are economically, the cost of bringing up each generation of people, if it was carried by the ruling class, would be enormous. So it plays a very important economic role. But also alongside that is an ideological role. Saying that the family is responsible for yourselves, you are atomized. Because actually, if your children are unemployed, or if you are poor, people say it's your fault. You know, maybe you're not teaching them the right things. If you're poor, you're not a hard enough worker. Now, we would say it's society to blame if there is high unemployment, if there are problems for children and young people. But the ideology of the family wants us all to be in little nuclear units, that we think it's all of our own responsibility, it's all our own fault. And that's very useful for capitalism, to make us think that the responsibility is all ours, particularly for women. Because women, with the rise of class society, women's role in reproduction has put her in so that the domestic sphere, the home, is seen as the woman's sphere. So that ideology still holds very strong, despite the fact the reality is very different. Most adult women work outside the home, have jobs. But still the ideas are, but you must still worry about the childcare, you must still worry about doing the shopping, cooking a nice dinner, making a nice home. Very important. In fact, it's even more important today because it doesn't fit the reality. They don't want people getting different ideas. They still want women to juggle, to look after, worry about the children, worry about the cooking, worry about the elderly who need looked after, even though they're a permanent part of the working class. And so therefore the economic role and the ideological role of the family are absolutely vital. And you can see this better if you always look at society as a totality. If you just look within the family, you see women's oppression just as interpersonal relationships between a man and a woman. In the family there is domestic violence, etc. Now those are things that are products of the horrible world we live in, absolutely. But people sometimes argue, the family, it serves the man. Well actually, ideology of the family tells the man it's his responsibility to provide. It's his responsibility to be, we call it, the breadwinner. That in itself is an oppressive view that a man has to fulfill. So the family does not serve the role of individual men, serve the interests of individual men, it serves the interest of capital. One point on this though, that's not all it does. If it was simply that, it probably would have gone a long time ago. But it's a contradictory thing. Families are things that people often love and want. It can be a haven in a heartless world. It can be a place where we can find unconditional love, that we care for each other. And in a capitalism that seems a brutal society, the family can be a place where we can find something good. And so, for many ordinary people, I think we have to be very clear. We do not say, abolish the family. Placards, down with the family. Of course not. That's not what we say. But we say how society uses our personal relationships in order to benefit them is something we are against. I do not know how people will live in socialism. Will they live in families? Will they live collectively? Will it be a mixture? We don't know. We shouldn't. We do not have a blueprint. We do not want one. People who make a revolution make a new society. But we can say what is wrong with today. And in fact, the way the family is used in society makes it harder for us to have good relationships with each other because of the expectations of society. So I think we have to start with society as a totality and not simply through the prism of gender. That is a cul-de-sac if we only look at it through the prism of gender. And I think that why we talk about class being the vital divide, the biggest divide in society, that gender is not the most important divide, class is. This is not just to see, you see, because many feminist writers would agree class is an important division, but they just see it as a poverty or as an economic inequality, another problem like racism or homophobia. But for Marxists, we see class as a two-way thing. Yes, it's another problem, but actually it is the source of our power. It is it's where we can fight. And this is the key thing about class. You see, Marx dismissed the idea that we should see class just as the workers being the most suffering class. Because he wasn't interested in class about suffering, he was interested in class as a collective force that can fight. And therefore, for Marxists, we see class as a social relationship, the exploiter and the exploited, the boss and the worker. And all the system's wealth, everything, the roads, the trains, the planes, everything that happens, the hospitals, the schools, all happen because workers work. Nothing would function under capitalism unless people like you and me went out to work every day. We create everything in society, and that is what makes us potentially powerful. And I think when we look at a Marxist approach to women's oppression, we give women agency. We do not just see women as victims. We see women as potential class fighters. And that is because women today are part of the working class. When I said the reality is not the woman at home and the man at work, the reality is man and woman at work and trying to make a home, is actually this puts women in this social force that has this unique ability to challenge the system. And why I say unique is because intrinsic to the working class is a pressure to unite over divisions. Because when there is an old trade union saying of united we stand, divided we fall, and that's true. And what it means is when workers struggle, go on strike, go into a dispute, they have to link arms against a boss. Now, this means they're forced to see each other, perhaps a migrant worker, a woman, or an LGBT person, as their allies, even if perhaps they have some bigoted prejudice in their heads. But when you're fighting, you have to link, and then you argue amongst each other. And actually, this is intrinsic to the class. And so what makes the working class unique is it's forced to act collectively without revolutionary socialists like some of us making everybody a revolutionary socialist first. We do not have to win every worker ideologically to socialism before they can have a fight against capitalism. It will be the struggle. The mass of people's ideas will change in struggle. We fight to win people as individuals. We fight against every expression of prejudice and bigotry. But ultimately, people change in the big struggles, and every revolution and massive struggles has been evidence of this. And therefore, when you have a society that divides us, capitalism divides us about whether it's migrants and LGBT people, but it also forces us together because it has to in order to extract a surplus from us. And this is the contradiction at the heart of society that gives us optimism about the change. So there cannot be two different and separate struggles, one against oppression and one against capitalism. So when we're fighting against low pay and sexist imagery and the commodification of women's bodies, these are all fighting against the symptoms of a system, and we should fight them. We should be the best fighters against those things, but we also have to see that we are also fighting against the wider system, because otherwise, if we don't fight the system, oppression will keep rising again like a zombie. We can fight against it, but the system can make it come back again. If we're going to get rid of it permanently, we have to get rid of the system. And we have to constantly see that all the time the ruling class wants to play us off each other. It wants to divide us by gender and sexuality and race and place of origin, place of birth. And one liberation will not come at the expense of another oppressed group. But oppression doesn't automatically push us together. If you are a woman being oppressed, you don't automatically side with a Muslim who is facing Islamophobia. That's not automatic. Within the working class, there is more pressure on people. And I think that's the big difference. And I think that when we look at what is happening today, we have to say that the economic crisis that has been since 2008, an enormous economic crisis, it means that what they are doing, the ruling class are out to get us. They want to break us. They want to make us pay for their crisis, caused by the banks, caused by the chaos of the system. And one of the ways they will do this is to impose an idea of the family that means let the family carry the burden of the cuts, of the cutbacks and the difficulties. And therefore, in Britain, figures show that women, working class women, have suffered 85% of the cuts that have been done by the Tory government in the last 5 years. And I will talk in a future session about the new Tory government that we have. So we have to say the fate of women is tied to the fate of the working class. Individual women, a few of them, can make it to the top on their own, make a lifestyle, make a comfortable life. They are a tiny minority of women, but the majority of women, their fate is tied to that of the class as workers in big battles. Now in Britain we saw magnificent, the most women workers ever on strike on the same day, on the 30th of June in 2011. It was absolutely out of this world, superb. In Britain there are more women joining unions than men. So women can see the collective possibilities of being in the class rather than being atomised and isolated and alienated in the home. And therefore, working class women have everything to gain from uniting with men to resist what is going on, to resist a system which turns us into commodities, to resist a system which makes us disposable, and to resist a system that is only interested in who and what generates a profit. And therefore, we see women as not objects of the system. We see women as people who can shape our own lives. And we have seen it not just in some of the struggles against austerity, but we've seen it in the revolutions. Real revolutions in our lifetime, which revolutions are processes, and at the moment the counter-revolution is crushing dissent, and it's, you know, it is brutal. And part of the brutality of the counter-revolution in places like Egypt and Yemen has been directed at women. Women have suffered sexual harassment and assault in Egypt by thugs and everything else. Even though sexual harassment was endemic in Egypt already, it is worse after the bringing down of Hosni Mubarak, because the ruling class understands that the unity that the revolution was its biggest danger. They hated the idea that women were in Tahrir Square. I was lucky enough to report from there for Socialist Worker for some of the days, in the 18 days. Women said they felt safe there. They slept the night in little tarpaulin tents with thousands of other strangers. They would never even be able to walk those streets before they took over Tahrir Square. It would be too dangerous for them. But they felt safe on Tahrir because Tahrir became a little mini experiment in social living for 18 days. And that sense of why the ruling class and, you know, the thugs and the military are punishing women is because they want to break that. They want to intimidate women out of the revolution and off the streets. But it shows you that what we've said is not just an abstract thing about the Russian Revolution or the German Revolution in history. In our lifetimes, we have seen that any big struggles, women come to the forefront. The question of women's oppression comes to the forefront. This is something that will be intrinsic to any struggles that grow up. And I think that when we see what's happening today, capitalism still is in crisis. This is not just a crisis of the banks, it's a crisis of the system that it is struggling to recover from. And I think, therefore, when we say that the working class is key to fight for change, to fight against women's oppression, to be part of the force that can fight for women's liberation, we have to say, we're not saying here's the working class is going to come and rescue women. You know the sort of thing in the movies where somebody comes on a white horse as the big rescuer. No, we are the working class. The working class is women and men, LGBT and straight, Muslim, Asian, migrant, born in the same country. This is what the working class is. And that's why we say that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class. And what that means for us as Marxists and socialists is that it's about self-emancipation, isn't it? When we say the working class can struggle, we say that that's because we believe that that is how you can emancipate yourself. We don't look to experts, guerrillas who fight, experts who stand in Parliament. And we rely ultimately on the struggle of people like us, of the mass of ordinary women and men. And that, for me, is not just about how we find our own agency in challenging women's oppression, but it's also how we can fight to see the possibility of building a different sort of society, a socialist society, and any vision of socialism will have women's liberation absolutely at its heart. I'll leave it there.